There are times in a man's life when compassion becomes more dangerous than a loaded gun. Johnny Mackenzie watched the young Apache woman lying by the creek that cut through his property. The blood that flowed from his left shoulder had dyed the crystal-clear water red, creating small whirlpools that were lost downstream. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe less. His black hair clung to his grief-stricken face, and his dark eyes stared at him with a mixture of defiance and despair that he knew well. The farmer had built his life in that arid Arizona land with his own calloused hands. 15 years ago, when he arrived in those parts carrying only a backpack and dreams of peace, he never imagined that one day he would be faced with a decision that could cost him his life. The ranch was modest, but prosperous enough to give him the quiet he sought after years of wandering the territory as a mercenary. The wound on the young woman was deep. A bullet had gone through his shoulder, probably fired by some soldier or bounty hunter patrolling the area. She tried to get up, but the forces abandoned her with each attempt. Her lips moved in whispers that Johnny didn't understand, Apache words that sounded like a prayer or a curse. The hot desert wind carried the smell of blood and dry land. In the distance, the mountains rose like silent sentinels, witnesses to countless tragedies that unfolded in those disputed lands. Johnny knew that helping an injured Apache was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. Tensions between whites and natives had intensified in recent months, and any gesture of solidarity was seen as betrayal by both sides. But there was something in the eyes of this young woman that prevented him from simply going on his way. Perhaps it was the memory of his own sister, killed years ago during an attack by bandits. Perhaps it was just the spark of humanity that still lingered in his chest, hardened by time and circumstances. Johnny knelt beside the young woman and, with careful gestures, examined the wound. She pulled back instinctively, but the pain made her moan softly. Johnny raised his hands in peace, speaking in a low and calm tone, as he did with the frightened horses. It didn't matter that she didn't understand his words. The tone was universal. Slowly, he tore a piece of his own shirt and began to stop the bleeding. The decision was made even if her rational mind screamed against her. Johnny lifted the young woman in his arms, surprised by her lightness, and walked towards the house. Each step took him away from safety and brought him closer to an uncertain future. The sun began to set, painting the sky with orange tones that were reflected in the windows of his modest dwelling. Inside the house, Johnny prepared a makeshift bed by the fireplace and treated the wound with the few medical supplies he had. The young woman had lost consciousness, but her breathing remained constant. He covered her with a blanket and sat down in a nearby chair, rifle within reach, knowing that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Night fell on the ranch like a heavy blanket. Johnny couldn't sleep, alternating between watching the young woman and watching the darkness through the window. Every shadow that moved out there could be an Apache warrior seeking revenge or soldiers looking for a fugitive. He had chosen the side of compassion in a world that severely punished such a choice. When the first ray of sunlight touched the distant mountains, Johnny got up and walked to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold in his veins. On the horizon, a dark line was slowly approaching. They were knights, many knights, moving in formation that he recognized immediately. These weren't American soldiers. It was an Apache war group. As they got closer, Johnny could count their silhouettes silhouetted against the morning sky. 80 men, perhaps more, all armed and painted for war. They had come to pick up the young woman, and Johnny knew that his presence there meant only one thing. He would be held responsible for her injury, no matter the truth of the facts. The farmer looked at the young woman, who was still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the approaching drama. He could hand it over and try to explain his innocence, but he knew Apache code well. Once she had been found on his property, he had become part of history. There would be no explanations or negotiations, only justice as they understood it. Johnny checked his weapons and ammunition. He had enough food and water for a few days, but against 80 experienced warriors, even the best marksman wouldn't stand a chance. The house was solid, built to withstand desert storms, but it had not been designed to withstand a prolonged siege. The sound of approaching hooves echoed through the valley, an ominous drum that marked the rhythm of his possible death. Johnny took a deep breath, feeling the bitter taste of fear mixed with a strange sense of peace. He had made the right choice, even if it cost him his life. In a world where violence was the most widely spoken language, he had chosen to speak the language of mercy. The young Apache opened her eyes at that moment, as if the impending danger had awakened her instincts. She looked at Johnny and then at the window. where the dust kicked up by the horses was already visible. Her eyes filled with a terrible understanding, and she tried to get up, ignoring the pain she certainly felt. Johnny motioned for her to lie down, but she nodded vigorously, whispering words in Apache that sounded like a desperate request. He didn't need to understand the language to know what she was saying. She tried to warn him of danger, tried to protect the one who had risked everything to save her. The siege was closing, and Johnny Mackenzie was preparing to face the consequences of an act of kindness in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The sun rose over the desert, illuminating what could be the last day of his life, and he found that he regretted nothing. Johnny watched through the crack in the window as the warriors positioned themselves in a semicircle around his property. They didn't approach the house, not yet. It was a tactic he knew well from his days as a scout for the army. First the siege, then the psychological pressure, until the opponent made a fatal mistake out of desperation. The leader of the group was easily recognizable. Mounted on a pinto horse, he wore a headdress of eagle feathers that danced in the morning wind. His war paintings formed intricate patterns in red and black over his tanned face, and a deep scar cut his forehead from his left eyebrow to his hairline. Johnny figured he must have been 40, old enough to have seen many battles and lost a lot because of the white men. The young Apache woman managed to sit up on the makeshift bed, ignoring the pain she was surely feeling in her injured shoulder. She stared at Johnny intensely and pointed to herself, whispering something that sounded like a name. Then he pointed out where the warriors were waiting and shook his head negatively. Johnny understood that she was trying to tell him something important about her situation, but the language barrier separated them like an unbridgeable chasm. The silence that settled over the ranch was more threatening than any war cry. Johnny knew that stillness. It was the calm that precedes the storm, the moment when everyone involved weighs their options and prepares for what's to come. He double-checked his weapons: a Winchester rifle with 15 rounds, a Colt revolver with 6 rounds, and a double-barreled shotgun with only 4 rounds of buckshot. Enough ammunition for a skirmish, not enough for a war. The farmer walked to the kitchen and filled all available containers with fresh water from the well. If the siege were to be prolonged, the thirst would be as deadly as the enemy's arrows. He also gathered his provisions: dried meat, beans, flour, and some vegetables that he had harvested in the garden the previous week. Food for maybe a week if it was economical. A movement outside caught his attention. The Apache leader had dismounted and walked slowly toward the house, his hands visible and away from his body. It was not a surrender. It was an invitation to parliamentarian. Johnny knew that refusing would be interpreted as cowardice, but accepting could be a death trap. He looked at the young woman who had crawled to the window and watched the leader with an expression of recognition and fear. The man stopped about 100 yards from the balcony and shouted something in Apache. His voice echoed through the valley, charged with authority and restrained anger. Johnny didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a demand, not a request. The young woman next to him became visibly paler and muttered something that sounded like a plea. Johnny made his decision. He left the rifle against the wall, but kept the revolver in his holster and walked to the front door. He opened it slowly, keeping his hands in sight, and took a step onto the balcony. The desert heat hit him like a fist, and sweat began to run down his back even in the still cold morning. The Apache leader studied him in silence for long seconds. His eyes were like polished stones, hard, but reflecting a keen intelligence that had kept his people alive through hard times. When he finally spoke, it was in broken but understandable English. "You take Chief's daughter. Where is she?" Johnny felt the world spin as he understood the magnitude of his situation. The young woman he had saved was not just any Apache. She was the daughter of the leader who now stood before him. This explained the presence of 80 warriors and the seriousness of the moment. He had, without knowing it, kidnapped the most important person in that tribe. "She's hurt," Johnny replied, keeping his voice steady despite the fear that ran cold in his blood. "I found it by the stream, bullet in the shoulder. I help." The leader's face twitched in an expression of distrust. "You lie. White man always lie. You hurt my daughter." Johnny nodded slowly. "No, I help." She was dying. The tension in the air was almost palpable. The other warriors had moved discreetly, closing in even more. Johnny could feel dozens of eyes fixed on his every move, arrows pointed in his direction, waiting only for a signal from his leader to turn him into a human pin. From inside the house came a faint but distinct cry. The young woman had managed to get up and was walking towards the door, leaning against the wall. His face was pale from blood loss and exertion, but his eyes shone with determination. She spoke briefly in Apache, addressing the leader, her father, with words that sounded like a desperate explanation. The man listened in silence, his expression slowly moving from anger to confusion, and then to something Johnny couldn't fully identify. When the young woman finished speaking, he stood still for long seconds, processing the information he had received. "Ayana say, you save her life," the leader said finally, his voice charged with complex emotion. "She says, blue soldiers shoot. You heal wound. You give food, water." Johnny felt a little relief, but he knew he wasn't out of the woods yet. The situation had changed, but not necessarily improved. He had gone from kidnapper to savior, but that didn't guarantee his safety. The rules of Apache honor were complex, and he did not fully understand them. "Is Ayana your name?" Johnny asked, looking at the young woman who was still leaning on the doorframe. The leader nodded slowly. "Ayana, eternal flower, my only daughter." The pain in the man's voice was evident. Johnny understood that he was facing a father who had thought he had lost his most precious possession and now found himself in an impossible situation. Gratitude and suspicion struggled in his dark eyes. "I didn't know," Johnny said sincerely. "I found a wound. I couldn't let it die." The leader studied Johnny for a moment longer, then turned to the other warriors and shouted orders in Apache. Slowly, some of them lowered their weapons, but Johnny noticed that they remained in position. The situation had become less deadly, but it was still extremely dangerous. "My name is Nalnish," the leader said. "You save Ayana's life. This create, how to say, debt. But you too, white man in Apache land. This creates a problem." Johnny realized that he was at the center of a complex cultural dilemma. Nalnish was caught between gratitude for having his daughter saved and the need to maintain his authority before his tribe. Showing weakness or excessive gratitude to a white man could undermine his leadership. "What do you want from me?" Johnny asked directly. Nalnish looked at his daughter, then back to Johnny. "Ayana lived because of you, but she's also here because of blue soldiers. They seek to kill my people, use you, to reach us." The accusation hung in the hot desert air. Johnny realized that he was being blamed not only for the young woman's injuries, but for the entire situation that had led to it. In Nalnish's mind, perhaps all white men were equally responsible for the actions of the army. "I'm not a soldier," Johnny said. "I'm just a farmer. I want peace." "Peace!" Nalnish repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept. "White man talk peace while blue soldiers kill Apache women and children." Johnny knew there was no adequate answer to this. The atrocities committed by both sides had created a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. He was just a man caught in the middle of forces far greater than his understanding or control. The sun rose in the sky, increasing the heat that was already starting to become oppressive. Johnny could see that some of the younger warriors were impatient, their hands moving restlessly next to the weapons. Tensions were rising, and he knew he needed to find a solution before the situation erupted into violence. The standoff dragged on as the sun rose inexorably in the cloudless sky. Johnny watched Nalnish assess the situation with the patience of an experienced predator. The Apache leader had not gotten to that position by making rash decisions, and every second that passed was used to calculate the consequences of his next actions. Ayana had returned inside the house, but Johnny could feel her watching through the window. She understood better than anyone there the delicate balance that had been established. Her presence had saved Johnny's life momentarily, but it had also created an unprecedented situation for his father. Nalnish was caught between the laws of Apache hospitality, which required gratitude for those who had saved his daughter, and the need to maintain his authority in the face of 80 warriors who were waiting for some kind of justice. One of the younger warriors approached Nalnish on a bay horse. His war paintings were more elaborate than those of the others, suggesting some kind of special position in the tribal hierarchy. He spoke quickly into the leader's ear, gesturing in the direction of the house and then pointing to the horizon. Johnny didn't need to understand the words to know that the young warrior was advising more direct and violent action. Nalnish listened in silence, then responded with words that sounded like a firm but non-aggressive order. The young warrior retreated, but Johnny noticed the frustration in his gestures. The group's patience was wearing thin, and even Nalnish's authority had its limits when faced with the thirst for revenge of men who had lost family and friends to the bullets of American soldiers. The midday heat turned the air into visible waves that distorted the distant landscape. Johnny felt the sweat run down his back as he stood motionless on the porch, knowing that any sudden movement could be interpreted as hostility. His legs began to tingle from the prolonged tension, but he kept his posture upright and his hands visible. It was then that the sound of distant hooves echoed through the valley, coming from the opposite direction to the Apache warriors. Johnny saw the immediate reaction in the faces of Nalnish's men, renewed tension and instinctive movement toward the guns. A new variable had entered the already complex equation, and Johnny feared that it was exactly what could turn this tense situation into a bloodbath. A patrol of 5 cavalry soldiers appeared on the horizon, their blue uniforms contrasting with the brown of the desert. They rode in reconnaissance formation, clearly looking for something or someone. Johnny immediately understood that they were hunting Ayanna, following the trail of blood she had left to his ranch. The lieutenant who commanded the small group was young, probably on his first mission in the territory. Johnny could see his inexperience in the way he held the reins and the rigidity of his posture. The soldiers accompanying him seemed more experienced, but 5 men against 80 Apache warriors was nothing more than a morning snack for Nalnish and his men. The situation had become exponentially complicated. Nalnish now faced not only the question of what to do with Johnny, but also the presence of American soldiers in territory he considered his by ancestral right. Johnny saw the Apache leader make discreet gestures to his men, who immediately began to position themselves for a possible ambush. The lieutenant and his men approached the ranch, seemingly oblivious to the mortal danger that surrounded them. Johnny noticed that the Apache warriors had positioned themselves almost invisibly among the rocks and bushes scattered across the terrain. To the soldiers, the ranch looked deserted, except for the lone figure of Johnny on the porch. Johnny found himself at the center of an impossible situation. If he alerted the soldiers to the Apache presence, he would be seen as a traitor by Nalnish and certainly executed. If he remained silent, he would witness the massacre of 5 men who, regardless of their faults, were compatriots. Moreover, the death of the soldiers on his property would definitely mark him as an Apache collaborator in the eyes of the American army. The lieutenant raised his hand to signal stop when he spotted Johnny. He shouted something about looking for a wild wound that had attacked a nearby detachment. Johnny felt his stomach tighten as he realized how the truth had been distorted. Ayanna had not attacked anyone. She had been attacked and injured, probably while looking for food or water for her tribe. Nalnish stood motionless like a stone statue, but Johnny could see the tension growing in his muscles. The Apache leader was calculating whether it was worth risking the safety of his men to eliminate a small patrol that represented all the evil the white man had brought to his land. Johnny made a decision that he knew could cost him his life. He made a discreet gesture in the direction of the soldiers, indicating that they should withdraw immediately. The lieutenant interpreted the signal as fear and shouted something about protection and the performance of duty. The officer's youthful arrogance was about to cost the lives of all his men. It was Ayanna who broke the deadlock. She appeared at the door of the house, staggering but determined, and shouted something in Apache to her father. Her words sounded like a desperate plea, and Johnny saw tears streaming down his young face. She understood that her presence there was about to cause the death of innocent people, and that was more than her conscience could bear. Nalnish looked at his daughter for a long moment, then at Johnny and finally at the approaching soldiers without suspecting the danger. Johnny saw something changing in the Apache leader's expression, a decision being made that went against all of his warrior instincts, but one that honored something deeper in his soul. The Apache leader made an almost imperceptible gesture, and his warriors began to slowly retreat, disappearing among the rocks like desert ghosts. Johnny could hardly believe what he was witnessing. Nalnish was choosing mercy over revenge, following the example his own daughter had set in asking for clemency. When the soldiers finally reached the porch, they found only Johnny and an injured young Apache woman whom he claimed to have found passed out near the creek. The lieutenant seemed suspicious, but Ayanna's wound was evidently real, and Johnny's story about having provided first aid seemed plausible enough. Johnny watched Ayanna being taken away by the soldiers, knowing that she would likely be transported to a distant reservation far away from her father and his tribe. The young woman's eyes met his for a brief moment before leaving, and in them he saw a deep gratitude mixed with an infinite sadness. She understood the sacrifice everyone had made that day. Her father had renounced revenge, Johnny had risked his life for compassion, and she herself had chosen exile to avoid further bloodshed. When the patrol disappeared over the horizon, taking Ayanna, Johnny remained on the porch watching the rocks and bushes, where he knew Nalnish and his men were still hiding. Slowly, The Apache leader emerged from his hiding place, now alone. The other warriors had left, probably following orders to return to the main camp. Nalnish approached the balcony one last time, his eyes revealing a complex mix of respect, sadness, and something that could be interpreted as an odd form of friendship. He didn't speak, but Johnny understood the silent message. The Apache leader had lost his daughter once again, but this time by choice, to honor the lesson of compassion she had tried to teach. The man mounted his horse and walked away slowly, without looking back. Johnny knew he would probably never see Nalnish or Ayana again, but he would forever carry the memory of that day when compassion had prevailed over hatred in a world that seemed to have forgotten how to make that choice. The silence that followed Nalnish's departure was unlike any Johnny had experienced. It was not the menacing stillness of moments of tension, nor the desolate emptiness of loneliness. It was a silence full of meaning, loaded with the weight of the choices made and the lives saved. Johnny remained on the porch until the last echo of the hooves disappeared into the thin desert air. His knees trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the deep relief of someone who had gone through a hurricane and emerged in one piece on the other side. He looked at her calloused hands and saw that they trembled too, the same hands that had stopped the blood of a young Apache girl and perhaps changed the course of many lives in the process. The stream continued to flow near the house, its constant murmur a reminder of how it had all begun. Johnny walked to the shore and knelt in the same spot where he had found Ayana. The water had washed away the traces of blood, but he could still visualize the young woman lying there, her dark eyes shining between pain and determination. The weeks that followed brought subtle but profound changes to the ranch's routine. Johnny found that he could no longer look at the horizon without thinking about Ayana and wondering about her fate on the reservation. Nor could he ignore the feeling that he had participated in something greater than his own existence, a moment when humanity had triumphed over the survival instinct. Occasionally, he would find small signs that he was not completely alone in these lands. An Apache footprint near the well, specifically arranged branches near the trail, small food offerings left on strategic rocks. Johnny understood that he was being watched and protected from afar, a quiet courtesy of Nalnish, who honored the bond created on that fateful day. A month after the events, Johnny received an unexpected visit from a merchant who was passing through the region. The man brought news from the nearest military fort and casually mentioned a young Apache girl who had impressed the officers with her dignity and intelligence. She had become a sort of intermediary between her tribe and the authorities, using her expertise to avoid unnecessary conflict. Johnny knew immediately that it was Ayana. The young woman had found a way to turn her forced separation from her family into an opportunity to serve as a bridge between two worlds. She was applying the lesson of compassion she had learned in those days at the ranch, multiplying the impact of that moment of shared humanity. The seasons passed, and Johnny grew old with a wisdom he didn't possess before. He continued to work his land, but now he understood that he grew more than plants. He cultivated the memory that it was possible to choose goodness even when everything around him screamed for violence. On the hottest days of summer, when the sun mercilessly punished man and beast, Johnny sometimes imagined seeing a familiar figure on the horizon. Whenever this happened, he would bring fresh water to the stream and leave it in a clay gourd near the place where it had all begun. The water always disappeared during the night, and Johnny preferred to believe that he was still taking care of those who had taken care of him. The desert had taught him that some seeds need a long time to sprout, but when they finally do, they create deep roots that withstand the biggest storms. The seed of compassion planted that day between a lone farmer, a young Apache girl, and a warrior leader had germinated into something bigger than all of them. Johnny Mackenzie died peacefully in his bed 15 years later, at the age of 62. Her funeral was attended not only by the region's few white neighbors, but also by an Apache delegation led by a middle-aged woman with old scars on her left shoulder and eyes that shone with wisdom gained through suffering. Ayana had returned to pay her last respects to the man who had saved her life, and in doing so, she had saved much more than that. She brought with her seeds of Apache medicinal plants, which she planted around the grave as a symbol of eternal gratitude and constant renewal. The stream continued to flow near the abandoned ranch, carrying its crystal-clear waters through the unforgiving desert. And on the banks of that stream, Apache medicinal plants grew side by side with local wildflowers, creating a small but vibrant garden where two different cultures found a way to flourish together. Some stories don't need witnesses to be true. They live on in the memory of the land that witnessed them and in the hearts of those who were touched by their silent magic. Johnny and Ayana's story became one of those legends, not told in salons or recorded in newspapers, but whispered by the desert wind to anyone who could listen. The Wild West had known many stories of violence and revenge, but it had also been the scene of rare moments when compassion prevailed over hatred. On that small ranch lost in Arizona, a lone farmer had proven that sometimes a single act of kindness can change the course of many lives, creating waves of transformation that spread far beyond what meets the eye. If this story of compassion and redemption in the heart of the American wilderness has sparked something in your soul, get ready for more thrilling journeys through the wilds of the Wild West, where men and women faced impossible choices between survival and humanity. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of these epic narratives of courage, honor, and transformation, and leave your comment below telling which moment of this saga between Johnny and Ayana touched your heart the most. Whether it was the initial meeting by the bloody stream, the tension of the Apache siege, or perhaps the final reunion in the cemetery where two cultures came together in eternal gratitude.